There's something about fishing that stirs up an energy and excitement from deep within us. It could come from landing a personal best fish or by helping someone land their first fish ever. It's stories shared around the dinner table, and after a day on the water, the goal of learning more about the wonders that surround us. To us, it's the things that give our lives purpose and meaning. These are the stories told by the avid, the dedicated, and the passionate. This is the Love of Fishing podcast. The Love of Fishing podcast is proudly powered by Peter's Tackle and sponsored by Freedom Tackle, Silver Salmon, Dreamweaver, Team Underdog Cutbait, and Grimsby Tackle. Hello everybody and welcome to the Love of Fishing podcast, brought to you by Peter's Tackle. I'm your host Lyle Gator and welcome back to another week of the show. This week we have a good one in store. We're sitting down with Tim Allard, an Ontario writer who's going to brief us on some spring panfish techniques, some spots, and an overall approach on how you can be a better panfish angler. This week it's going to be great to talk to Tim. We've got a lot of great topics to go over as the weather starts to warm up, the ice starts to recede, and open water fishing becomes a reality. I'd like to thank you very much for tuning into this week's show. If you're a new listener, welcome to the show, and if you've been with us for a while, thank you again for tuning in. This week we're on Spotify as well as YouTube, so depending on where you're catching us, you can always catch us on the other platform. Wherever you go, you can think about fishing and listen to us talk about fishing here on the Love of Fishing podcast. There's a few people that I should thank as they have helped make the show possible as well. Thank you to our supporting sponsors, Freedom Tackle, Grimsby Tackle, Team Underdog Cutbait, the Silver Salmon Challenge, and Team Dreamweaver for your continued support of the Love of Fishing podcast. Guys, I know that you have a lot of choices when you hit the stores. Try and remember these great companies because they love fishing too. You know, spring panfish are something that I always look forward to at the start of every year. It brings back a lot of early memories of me fishing with my dad around Niagara in some of the local ponds and streams, and it's quite possible that it brings back memories for you too. Panfish are one of those things that can start people off with fishing when they're young, and it can also be a pretty technical pursuit. And I think that Tim's explanation of things here is really good no matter what level you're at. It will help you become a better panfish angler. And Tim has a lot of experience fishing for crappies and also other panfish in the Ottawa area where he's from. So it was really great to sit down and talk with him. I hope that you guys will enjoy this episode. Let's jump into our discussion with Tim Allard. Hey everybody, and welcome back to the Love of Fishing podcast. Today we have a very special guest. It's Tim Allard. Tim is an author. He does a lot of writing about multi-species fishing here in Ontario. And it's a real pleasure to have him on the show today. Welcome, Tim.
Thanks for having me.
So, Tim, I know you do a lot of fishing for a lot of different species, but today I thought it'd be interesting for the viewers as we get closer to spring to start talking about something that happens as the ice goes out and the open water starts to appear. I think it'd be really cool to pick your brain on some ice out panfish and sort of as spring progresses, the different bites, where things go. I'd like to hear your experiences.
Okay, sounds good.
Cool. So what's your approach when you start to get into your spring fishing as far as where you're going to target and maybe what you're going to use if you're a shoreline angler or somebody who has a small boat that wants to chase these spring panfish?
It's a good question. And so it's funny because when I talk about where to look first ice, I say start where you caught them late fall. And so when we talk about where to look in the spring for panfish, I say start around where you caught them at late ice. So what's going to be happening, right, is when we're talking panfish, these are all spring, summer spawners, right? If you know, it'll depending on where you are and water temperatures. Like bluegills, I think are the last ones in terms of the progression. I think perch start first.
Yep.
And nothing, you know, you're a writer too, so I'm gonna throw out some cliches and stuff, but not all the fish are always doing the same thing at the same time. So this is gonna happen in waves, but in terms of the different bodies of water, and then also fish within the system. But warm water is where it's at with respect to finding panfish as the ice leaves systems. And what I'm not talking about trying to find a very specific temperature. You can go around with your boat and pay attention to that is important, obviously, but for a shorebound angler, they're not going to have that option.
Yep.
So you want to fish shallow. And so these fish are going to be coming in to spawn in, shallow areas. They're going to, from my understanding of it, on some reading that I've done and kind of my own experience in the boat and on shore where I find them, is you're kind of looking for like sand, soft bottom, muck bottom areas, with some, there's probably going to be some gravel in the mix there, but
Yep.
Some weed growth is good cover. So when I'm looking at spots that I'm going to try and be fishing around, cover is a really big thing. Maybe we'll get to that a little bit later, but just in terms of like a high level where to look, bays. So you're going to want to be around bays, anything that looks really fertile, essentially, because what a lot of that means too is there's going to be dark bottoms associated with that. That's going to, absorb that heat from the sun, and it's just going to kick off the food chain, right? And so it's funny because I wrote an article. I'm not sure when this is going to air, but for Ontario Outdoors, and just talking about the concept of edges. And one of the things that I get into in that is how in the spring, the shoreline is, whether we're talking, stocked rainbow trout in a small inland lake or panfish, the shoreline is so key because it's going to heat up first. It's going to create a thermal edge compared to all that cold water out in, the main lake area or the deeper basins.
Yes.
But that's also that super fertile zone where everything, you're going to have your aquatic invertebrates in there, and your bait fish are going to go in there as well. And the warmer water is just going to increase metabolism and get things going faster. So as I say that, I think it's important to realize that panfish are going to be pushing shallow for a few reasons. I mentioned, they're going to be orienting around where they're going to be spawning. But a lot of times with, say crappies, for instance, and I know you don't want me to talk about them too much, but I'm not sure I'm going to listen that well because they're kind of my favorite one to target. But they're really pushing, I think, for food more than anything initially. And obviously perch and bluegills are as well. But there's a food factor there. And if I think about somebody who might be listening to this and is maybe new in the game, to give you another really key landmark from my perspective is a tributary. So any kind of inflow, feeder creek, something like that, those are always, really, really good to get around. In an urban area, could be, maybe you're going to be looking for a culvert or something like that that's connecting, more of a main body, water body to, a shallower marsh or something like that. But I'm a huge proponent of being and fishing around tributaries, feeder creeks in the spring. That's just going to bring, warm. It's going to bring rainwater. It's going to bring oxygen, nutrients. It's going to bring current. We a lot of times think about current with bigger fish, bigger predators, but quite a few years ago, I had a really good outing with a friend of mine, bank fishing along the St. Lawrence, and that's what we were doing. We were focusing on a tributary, and the panfish were kind of perch and crappie, and I can't remember if we got any bluegills actually, but yeah, it was all about being around that current edge and just off of it, and they were kind of stationed out. It was still early, as I mentioned, April, and they were kind of back off of the bank a bit on that, in kind of a bit of a shallower flat, but they weren't right up tight to it, but they were just outside of that main flow coming in out of that tributary, because it was a decent amount of flow. They wouldn't want it to be right in it, but they were around it, they were near it. And so that's just a conveyor belt for food, right? So, and there's other
Absolutely.
things at play. If you've got a tributary, you've also got typically you've got bottom, something different happening with the bottom. Either it got scoured out over the years from the erosion from the faster flow, so there you've got an edge.
Mm-hmm.
These are all kind of important things to think about. So those are some high level things to summarize: marshy bays, protected shorelines, tributaries, that sort of stuff.
That's great. So those are some great starting points if someone's looking at a map, if they're thinking about picking a spot. I wanted to do this talk today about the panfish because it's a great bite for shoreline anglers and also for families to get out on. The gear involved is not complicated. It can be very simple. It can also be as complicated as you want to make it. I fish with a lot of guys that are very dedicated panfish anglers or near shore anglers with floats. And it's one of my favorite things to do in the spring because you have so many different people out on the bank together. And I think that's really fun, especially in urban settings, like you mentioned. There are those opportunities. Is there anything that you could recommend if someone's starting out for panfish, maybe they're a shore angler, as far as a rod and reel setup, maybe a few baits, things like that?
Yeah, let's get to that. But something you mentioned made me just think we should also, if I can't recall if I said canals before, but
No.
any kind of artificial structure too, right? Like canals, marinas, or the marina harbors that would permit fishing within those areas.
Mm-hmm.
These sort of spots are going to be good as well, just because they're gonna hold that sheltered water in a lot of instances. On one hand, it's hard to talk in generalities because you sound like you're contradicting yourself, but on one hand I said find tributaries and feeder creeks, and now I'll talk out of the other side of my mouth and say maybe some canals can be good. We've got the Rideau Canal system up where I am, and I can
Yep.
walk the bank around there because there's not a lot of flow, but I've got some rocks associated with those structures that are gonna draw in heat and fish. And it's in addition to being a good area to maybe find spring panfish, you have the infrastructure around that to support a bank fishing scenario, right? You got like pathways and that sort of stuff, so that's conducive there too. Marinas and things of that nature can be good as well. So
For sure. Yeah. Providing the opportunity to actually be able to fish the fish and not just it be a good spot, for sure.
yeah.
So getting back to the gear,
Mm-hmm.
what would be something that you'd recommend for someone targeting spring panfish?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when we're talking panfish, because we're going to be including, perch and crappies in this and not just sunfish, I tend to lean towards a light powered rod as opposed to an ultralight. It's just a preference thing.
Mm-hmm.
I just prefer that little bit of extra power, and I just like the way that those rods handle. I have ultralights and they do come out in the boat and get used, but especially if you're starting to throw a float with it, you're just gonna, I find it's just a little bit easier to wield, just casts easier,
Yeah.
that sort of thing. I think most of my stuff is around the 6, 7 foot mark.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like I have some light rods that are, I think, a 6'8", this sort of thing. I use all sorts of different kind of lines, but 4 to 6 pound monofilament is pretty hard to beat in terms of getting started. It's going to play nice with bobber stops if you want to use those, or if you just want to clip the rep with a float and then run a jig under it.
Mm-hmm.
I love catching any kind of fish on a jig, so I use a lot of jigs for panfish. But I also catch a lot of panfish on small crankbaits, and more specifically, probably I'd say minnow baits, and like a little X wrap or countdown or that sort of stuff. And those are convenient from shore because you don't have to worry about snagging bottom. But in a boat context, usually I very rarely fish by myself. I do a bit, but generally I'm with somebody else. So I'd say a lot of the folks that I fish with tend to be, jig oriented. So I kind of throw, then I might throw a hard bait just to kind of play off what they're using.
Yes. Yep.
And a lot of times, a pattern that sometimes emerges is that we find the fish with hard baits because you cover a lot of water, you can kind of twitch them, and it doesn't always happen, but you can get a decent cast out of a hard bait. And then once you kind of zero in where they are, then you can kind of go to jigs and pick it apart a little bit more if you want. And this is a bit more of a crappie thing. Those the little jigs and microplastics, little like swim baits and stuff like that, I know is really, really productive from fish and perch on those shallow flats where they stack up on. I'm kind of thinking of friends that I've talked to, that are fishing like Simcoe or that sort of thing. So part of it depends too where they're oriented in the water column. Like a lot of those crappies that I'm referring to that are hitting hard baits, they're suspended. Those fish are up. They're hugging over weed edges, or they're around trees. Fallen trees is a really big thing too. So you don't want to go throwing you can fish a hard bait around them, but obviously when you want to go in, you want to use a jig. So
yeah, something that you mentioned about how the fish orient themselves in the water column. For those of the listeners that are new to panfish, understanding that a lot of times these fish won't be right on the bottom the same way that maybe a smallmouth would be or other game fish. These fish will come up in the water column, and that can sometimes be tricky if you're fishing with a float, or if you're not sure how deep a water you're over, because you might actually be fishing underneath the fish. And the whole reason why something like a hard bait is easier to throw fast is because you don't have to twitch your float and wait for it to get all the way back to the boat. You're actually bringing it through the column at a good speed. And like you said, finding out if they're a little bit deeper or a little bit shallower.
Yeah, one of the tips that I can give too with respect to fishing for panfish, and anytime you're casting, you want to be able to stay in contact with your presentation. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that you always need to be feeling your bait, because sometimes, say for example, if you're throwing a weightless stick bait for smallmouth, you're not necessarily going to be feeling that bait, but you have it on a semi-slack line, so that if a fish bites, you can see your line jump, and so even though you can't feel what the lure is doing, you're in contact with that bait. And I think if your listeners want an easy way to catch more panfish, it's going to be paying attention to what needs to happen so that you're in tune with your presentation. And so I'll give you two examples of how I do that. One is I really like using jigs that have a spinner blade associated with them. So there's a whole bunch of, like, just to throw something out there, the VMC makes a whole line of panfish jig and plastic combinations, and some of those have that underspin jig on them. That's the underspin blade. And so yes, that blade is going to give you a flash and thump and help attract panfish and potentially trigger them to bite more. But I also use that because it sends vibrations up the line, and it makes it easier for me to stay in contact with that lure when I'm not in a situation where I'm visually just making short pitches, watching my bait and targeting specific fish. That would be one example. The other is with respect to hard baits. And you mentioned smallmouth, which I love to fish. But when I'm talking about a little X-Wrap for a crappie, for instance, you can't work that as you would a smallmouth, in the sense of you can twitch it. And we often hear about working a jerk bait. You kind of twitch it on slack line, and then you point the rod tip back to the bait so that it can, continue sliding on slack line and maximize its action. Well, a couple of years ago, I was fishing crappies. Sorry to talk about them again.
That's okay.
And I was seeing them, and I was throwing a little X-Wrap in, and I was twitching it, and there was a couple of them, and they were coming up and sucking in that bait and spitting it out before I could set the hook. And that was me seeing them. So when I think about if I have slack in my line on a twitch pause presentation, I'm missing fish 100%. So what I learned is a lot of times I'll just work that bait with a swim stop, just more with the reel. Yep. Or if I pull it, or if I use the rod to manipulate it, I don't return the rod to the starting position, so that I can kind of keep, there isn't necessarily tight line on it, but it's that semi slack versus slack, so that if something happens, there's a good chance I'm going to be able to see that change in the line, because there is a little bit of tension on it. So those are two ways I try and stay in contact with the bait. To me, that's a really big thing for, to be able to do. And then of course, if you want to use a float as a way to control depth and that sort of thing, that's going to give you a really good visual as well. So something to mention.
Yeah, no, those are great tips. I'm going to try that out with using the reel a little bit more. I know when I'm throwing swim baits for smallmouth, it's sort of the same thing, where sometimes I want to really be hammering the bottom, but other times I need to like sweep it through. And how you control your line, you can do it with your rod and your reel. So that's a great tip. As far as conservation goes, these fish are delicious, and I'm not sure if you eat fish or not. I'm assuming you do.
Yep.
Yeah. A lot of people want to take fish home. Something in our area that I've come to know, because I fished a lot of the local holes, is over time, if people are keeping the big fish, it really wears down on the gene pool, and it takes away from that ability to, have those trophy size panfish. Can you give a few points on what type of fish you're looking for, and maybe how people can be a bit careful with where they're keeping fish from?
Yeah, sure. I won't pretend to be an expert on the subject of selective harvest and that sort of thing, but so yeah, I do enjoy eating fish, and I'll keep them sometimes for the table, but it tends to be more the rarity than the other. So you just let big fish go, because like you say, they're going to pass on their big fish genes. It can also impact, I'd encourage your listeners to go, and if they're interested in this topic, to go and do some research on bluegill populations, and what happens there if big bluegills get harvested. Because then I think the term that gets thrown around is you can get these potato chip fisheries, because you just don't, there just isn't that kind of natural competition for fish to grow bigger,
Right.
from what I understand. It doesn't, that was one example. I don't think that applies to perch and crappie the same way, but I wouldn't want to be quoted on it.
Right.
But really the goal is to let the bigger fish go, and keep something in that medium size range. And then you also need to consider as well, it's not just about size, it's about what kind of pressure you're putting on that. So let's say, for example, that you've been out a ton fishing the same body of water over the winter, and you've brought back several, pails, not necessarily full, but with a certain amount of fish in them. And then you're going to go out in the spring and start harvesting fish. Well, just consider your long-term impacts to that fishery when you're making those choices. It's not just a matter of, one isolated trip and what size of fish you're going to keep. You also have to think about the number of fish you and the other anglers, based on the overall pressure to that system, are receiving. I think that's another important consideration when we talk about selective harvest. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying not to eat fish, but you have to think about it in terms of that longer view standpoint, and just be mindful of that.
Yeah, for sure. We want to see fishing always, stay as good as it can be, or maybe improve. And us as anglers, we have a lot of responsibility as far as how we manage ourselves, and what fish we keep, and how much pressure we put on different systems. It can be tough in urban environments because everybody wants to fish. And, we've seen that in the last few years, more and more people getting out with families. We want that to be a positive experience. We want to promote that. So these little tips, like the ones that Tim just gave with how to responsibly manage, they're very, very important. So Tim, thank you for joining the Love of Fishing podcast today. If you're an ice fisherman, go check out his book, Ice Fishing, the Ultimate Guide. He's the author of that. And he's also always putting stuff on Ontario Out of Doors in their magazine, as well as other places. So Tim, thank you for joining the show today.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.
I'd like to once again thank Tim for taking the time to join the Love of Fishing podcast. It was great to sit down and talk with him. I hope that for the listeners, this was beneficial and that you learned something about either where you approach spring panfish or how you approach catching them. I know I learned a lot from Tim just in the brief 15 or 20 minutes that I talked to him. If you're interested in checking out some of his stuff, I think I mentioned it in the podcast, but he is the author of Ice Fishing, the Ultimate Guide. You can also check out a lot of his work in Ontario Out of Doors magazine, where he is a columnist and frequently has features in there. Tim is a really down-to-earth guy, and he loves helping people catch more fish, and I can't thank him enough. Now it's time for this week's giveaway. This week's giveaway is brought to you by Whitewater Coffee Crew. Thank you to owner and operator Kyle Morgan for his support of the Love of Fishing podcast once again. Kyle operates the Whitewater Coffee Crew brand, and he has a small coffee truck that he can bring around to your event if you're holding an event. He also has a full lineup of coffee that is great on those early mornings before you hit the water. So make sure you check out his brand. He, again, is Whitewater Coffee Crew, Kyle Morgan. Well, with that, it brings us to the end of another week here at the Love of Fishing podcast. I'd like to thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. I hope that you found it entertaining, informative, and enjoyable to spend time here with us. We have another great episode lined up next week, but until then, don't forget to get outside and go fishing. Peace.
Cause ever since I left you, I've been